Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and on today's podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt and the first federal bird reservation that was created called Pelican Island. It was Pelican Island set aside as a federal bird reservation, and it's really kind of the first move toward this idea of federally managed public lands and how that came to be. This is an interesting story. It has a lot of twists and turns from political maneuverings. We're going to kind of talk about, I guess, culture at the time. There's even a murder involved. It's a great little piece of history that I think there's a lot to learn from. So I'm going to get into that. I'm pulling from this book right here for those that are watching on YouTube. It's Douglas Brinkley's The Wilderness Warrior, which is huge. It's a huge body of work, and I've read it a couple of times actually. And I keep having this intention of kind of walking people through it and sharing the information I've gleaned from it on the podcast, but it's such a daunting task. I've decided, you know what, I'm just going to kind of take it piece by piece and every now and then do a little episode on this time period and share some knowledge and some, maybe gets a conversation going about the appropriate level of government in our public land system or in government in life in general. I'm a very conservative fella, and I like the idea of small government. The idea of federally managed public lands, it kind of goes up against my idea that I'm a firm believer in private property and this idea that the government shouldn't have their hands in a lot of things. And yet, in the case of public lands, I kind of diverge from that. And I hope as we cover this history that it paints a clearer image, a clearer understanding of why I feel that way. So before we get into that, I just want to remind you to use the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops. That always helps us out. Use the code GRITTY at Heather's Choice. If you got any backpacking needs coming on, that's the place to go. Get some good food from Heather's Choice. Make some of your own. I'm going to do some podcasts on that here in the near future, but check out Heather's Choice. The salmon chowder is good. Also use the code GRITTY there. Get 15% off her packaroons. You can use the code GRITTY at Valkyrie Archery for some sweet Jagger broadheads or whatever suits your needs. And then we also have a coupon code with Seek Outside. You can get 5% off their shelters now and their stoves. They do one sale a year, and that's on Black Friday. And after that, they really don't do any. They don't have the biggest profit margins on products either, so makes sense. But you can use the code GRITTY now to get 5% off their shelters and their stoves. So do that for us. Helps us out. I might recommend you check out the Silex for those that are on a budget. It's like a 2-person, 1-person shelter, super lightweight. You can get it with a stove jack built into it. I can't imagine hunting without a stove nowadays. So that would be my choice on a budget. And then the other thing I'd look into is the Cimarron. That's Cuban fiber. That is the cat's meow. It's like 1.5 pounds. It can sleep 2 guys comfortably with a stove and all your gear. It can sleep 3 if you need to. It's got a great footprint that's just right. You can find places to set it up on mountains, mountainsides, and mountaintops. It's a sweet setup. So check that out. And then for your backpacking, trekking pole needs, go to Sissy Sticks. Get a sweet pair using the code GRITTY. Get 15% off there. It's a carbon fiber upper with an aluminum lower, and they're awesome. All right. So getting into the podcast here, I'm going to read a little bit from the book, right out of the book. So bear with me. I think it's well written, and I'll do the best I can. Here we go. Starting in March 1903, President Roosevelt engaged in a Herculean effort to save the bird rookeries of Florida. Even though the term biodiversity would not be coined until about 1985, Roosevelt had an intuitive grasp of the concept. He worried that for some species in Florida, a hotspot for biodiversity, the death rate was far exceeding the birth rate, threatening them with extinction. The initial showdown over the future of Florida's wildlife took place at Pelican Island, a teardrop-shaped Atlantic coast islet situated 3 nautical miles from the hamlet of Sebastian. The island was home to the last breeding colony of brown pelicans on the east coast of Florida. Okay, so this island is covered with birds and fish, and it's a really biodiverse part of the world. And on the island are these pelicans, these brown pelicans, which Theodore Roosevelt had a particular fascination with, a love for. And it goes on to say, of all the Florida avians, it seemed that the brown pelican was Roosevelt's favorite. The brown pelicans were the finest fishermen Roosevelt knew. That pelicans were such superb natural fishermen, however, may have enthralled the president, but it irritated the dickens out of rural Floridians. So picture this. There's these birds. They smash the fish. They're awesome fishermen. Lots of fish. But now you have these people that have settled in this area. And we're talking the 1850s, 1859, somewhere in this period of time. Since brown pelicans had an almost insatiable appetite for scooping up finned prey, Florida fishermen saw the birds as unwelcome competition, a hindrance to their livelihood. Like woodpeckers devouring corn or mockingbirds incessantly pecking at grapevines, the mere sight of brown pelicans flying over the low gray river with pouches chock full of fish to feed their nestlings made fishermen reach for a gun. The pelicans' fishing grounds were supposed to be humans' fishing grounds. Therefore, the pelicans had to be eradicated. What locusts were to a Nebraskan farmer, brown pelicans were to Florida's commercial fishermen. But to Roosevelt, pelicans were a marvelous example of Darwin's evolutionary theory at work. Unlike most birds, pelicans were not masters of evasion. They actually liked people. Unfortunately, that made them even more vulnerable to being slaughtered for their quills, as mounts, for their eggs, and even for target practice. How they had survived so long, given their friendliness, intrigued Roosevelt. So these birds are here on the island, and you notice in here that people were taking them for their quills, as mounts, for their eggs. And something that we today don't necessarily pick up on is today in the United States, you can't just go and shoot a whole bunch of, let's say ducks, for example, without a license. And then also, you can't go and shoot these ducks and then sell them on the open market. You can't sell their meat. You can't sell their feathers. You can't sell their body parts in any way. And the reason for that is because of the Lacey Act. The Lacey Act was passed in 1900. The Lacey Act of 1900, or simply the Lacey Act, is a conservation law in the United States that prohibits trade in wildlife, fish, and plants that have been illegally taken, possessed, transported, or sold. It was introduced into Congress by Republican John F. Lacey, and the act was signed into law by President William McKinley in May 25, 1900. And it protects both plants and wildlife by creating civil and criminal penalties for those who violate the rules and regulations. Okay. But basically what the Lacey Act does is that it prohibits commercial hunting. So the buffalo, for example, we all know, we've all heard these stories about how the buffalo were being slaughtered by buffalo hunters, and the meat or the hides or the tongues, various parts of the gallbladder, these different parts of the buffalo were then taken and sold on the open market. This commercial style of hunting, kind of like commercial fishing, was completely unregulated. There was no permits, nothing around it. And so naturally, if you're a poor immigrant or a poor settler in the United States at this time, you're just trying to make ends meet. You're just trying to feed a family. You don't have a job. One of the things you could go do is go shoot some animals and sell the meat. You could hunt for a living almost. Actually hunt rare species, get birds, get things that the Chinese market wanted, or perhaps in this case, as we talk about Pelican Island, there were plumers, and these feathers were really sought after by the fashionistas of France and New York and so on. So there was a market for these things, and you could make money off of it by hunting animals. One of the things that Theodore Roosevelt noticed right away and that he helped put in place was this Lacey Act of 1900, which made it illegal to just hunt commercially. The original act was directed at the preservation of game and wild birds, making it a federal crime to poach game in one state with the purpose of selling the bounty in another. The law prohibited the transportation of illegally captured or prohibited animals across state lines and addressed potential problems caused by the introduction of non-native species of birds and animals into native ecosystems. Okay, so actually this is interesting. I was once investigated on the grounds of the Lacey Act. I shot a wolf with a bow when I was in Idaho. It was a pretty cool experience. Had this wolf come in as I was calling elk in, and a bull was actually coming into the calls. You could hear him. He made like one little small bugle, and then he was moving down the hill. So I got in position. I thought he'd come into this opening. I'd sort of ranged all these distances in this thick bit of timber, and these wolves came running into the trees. And there was a couple black ones and a few gray ones. I think all in all, there were 6 or 7 wolves. I couldn't count because they were running all over exactly how big the pack was. And I came to full draw. I knew I didn't have time to range. They were moving in fast on this. And I just pulled my bow back, got ready, saw an opening. And I knew if that wolf walked into the opening, I could stop him with my cow call and then let it rip. Sure enough, walked into a shooting lane. I gave it a harsh cow call, and all the wolves just froze and looked right toward me. And then I settled the pin, and I shot this wolf. It was about 35 yards. Not a long shot, 35, 40, something like that. And wolf died. And then we take the wolf in Idaho, there are some rules around reporting a wolf being killed. And because it was recently off the endangered species list and it's being managed by the state, and it falls under the laws of the Lacey Act, where you can't take a wolf over state lines unless it's been sealed or authorized by the state of Idaho. And this is kind of the same for like bighorn sheep. You'll see, if you've seen this, if you've done this, or bears on Prince of Wales Island, which I've done many times, when you take some of these animals, in order to transport them across state lines, they have to be inspected by the local state game agency. They do some things, they check it, they certify that it was legal, that it had a full curl, that the bear was of the right sex or age or whatever it might be. And then they basically seal it somehow, or they put a metal tag on it, or in the case of a bighorn, they like actually drill into the horn and they insert like a plug that shows that it's been inspected by the state. Okay, it makes it yours at that point, legally and completely yours for transport, display, and whatever. So there's this process of taking an animal that is owned by the people of the state and managed by the state. So in trust, the state manages the animals, but the animals technically are owned by the citizens of the state. And the state has rules on how these animals can be hunted and harvested and so forth. And some of these animals that have been under federal protection or fall under different rules, they have to be certified or verified before they become yours. So when you have a tag and you shoot an animal, it goes from being so first of all, when you buy a tag, you have the right to go hunt under the rules and regulations established by the state. Once you shoot the animal, it is no longer owned by the people of the state. It now becomes yours, becomes my property that I have the tag and license to acquire, and I can tag that animal, put the license with, and I have the hunting license to go with that. And now the animal becomes mine. It's a private property thing. It's now goes from held in trust by the people to owned by me. Okay. Now, when you shoot like I said, certain animals like a bighorn sheep, before it can technically become yours all the way, you've got to get it inspected and cleared by the state per the regulations. So in Idaho, the wolf has to be dropped off, I think, within, I can't remember. I'm going to have someone on from the Idaho Fish and Game Department actually to talk a little more about wolves and wolf management. But basically, the wolf has to be reported within 24 or 48 hours of being harvested. And then it needs to be taken into the game agency, a check station. I think within 48 hours or something of being killed. I don't know the exact time frame, but Idaho is unique. At least back then, when I took this wolf, the game agencies are closed on a Saturday and Sunday. So then you've got to take your wolf. You have to wait till like a Friday or a Monday so you can go into the offices during their hours. However, the state of Idaho has a process where you can take it to a licensed location in the form of a taxidermist usually, and that taxidermist can actually take your wolf and then submit it to the state on your behalf, like on a, when their hours open. That way the state has worked out some arrangements so that you can, if you're visiting from out of state and you take an animal and you have to have it inspected, the fact that they're closed is a major problem. So you can check it in with a local taxidermist that's licensed, and then that taxidermist can then take your wolf in for you. And they're willing to do that because it's part of, then you're paying them also for a fee to do that. And so anyway, I dropped this wolf off on a weekend because I wanted to get back to where I was hunting, and we drop it off. Well, I don't know, months and months later, Idaho Game and Fish was doing a routine inspection, and they're like, we have this wolf that was reported by phone that it was taken, but we don't have the actual wolf. And so there's an investigation to see if I took it across state lines and where it had gone, and it was a violation of the Lacey Act and so on. And it turned out that it was just a mistake by the taxidermist who did not actually submit the wolf to the game agency because it got mixed up, and he ended up getting a fine for that. And it was kind of a bummer because I was like, he's trying to help out the state, but technically he did make a mistake. So these things happen, and it's all part of this process of this thing where we're trying to limit commercial hunting, make it illegal so that our wildlife populations are regulated and managed in a positive way and shared, like that. Like those resources can be shared across all groups of people. It's not something that we just exploit until it's gone. Okay, so there's a little background on this Lacey Act, and President Theodore Roosevelt, he becomes president. Well, first let me say this. Let me give you a little history here. So in 1859. Pelican Island was considered this paradise. Okay, 1859, remember that. And Roosevelt first learned about the birds of Pelican Island from the published notes of Dr. Henry Bryant of the Boston Society of Natural History, recorded in 1859. And he says, Dr. Bryant, in his capacity as a professional ornithologist, which is like a bird studier, scientifically recorded the scores of brown pelicans and other water birds he encountered on fantastically misshapen clumps of mangrove in the Indian River Lagoon. Quote, the most extensive breeding place was on a small island called Pelican Island, about 20 miles north of Fort Capron, Bryant wrote in his diary. Quote, the nests here were placed on the tops of mangrove trees, which were about the size and shape of large apple trees. Breeding in company with the pelicans were thousands of herons, Peale's egret, the rufous egret, and little white egret, with a few pairs of the great blue heron and roseate spoonbills, and immense numbers of manowar birds and white ibises were congregated upon the island. So this is 1859, and the story here by this ornithologist, Dr. Henry Bryant, was that this is just a bird paradise. It's just this incredible, incredible spectacle of all these birds in this beautiful place. Then fast forward. We're going to fast forward to 1879. So remember, I was talking 1859. So we're talking 20 years later, 1879. Dr. James Henshaw, following in Bryant's footsteps, visited the Indian River Lagoon on a collection trip, expecting the best. Traversing trails that became a trough of swamp water to get to Pelican Island, Henshaw was astounded by what he encountered. The mythical rookery was now a dead zone. The mangroves and water oaks of this island have all been killed by the excrement of the pelicans which breed here, Henshaw wrote in his journal. This guano, which lies several inches deep on the ground, is utilized by the settlers as an efficient fertilizer. At a distance, the dead trees and bushes and ground seemed covered with frost or snow, and thousands of brown pelicans were seen flying and swimming around or perched upon the dead branches. As we passed, we saw a party of tourists at the island shooting down the harmless birds by scores through mere wantonness. As volley after volley came booming over the water, we felt disgusted at the useless slaughter and bore away as soon as possible and entered the Narrows. So 20 years later, it goes from this bird paradise that's just, mind-blowing to piles of guano, which is just bird dung, bird crap everywhere, inches of it, and dead trees. That's 20 years later. So there's this disturbing report by James Henshaw about the island. So it's fading fast. You're talking in a 20-year period. And largely this is due to overharvest, overfishing, over everything. And so you have, and then farming. And so as human beings move into this place, they just crushed it. All right. So then Theodore Roosevelt, 20 years later, Theodore Roosevelt becomes President of the United States in 1901. And Theodore Roosevelt wants to save these animals. And it's not just the birds on Pelican Island, but he's always had, if you read about Theodore Roosevelt, he always had this fascination with birds, the Audubon Society. He was part of that group. He loved bird watching, bird collecting. But he was really kind of a naturalist where he liked all animals. But he did have a special affinity for birds too. We all know how much he loved buffalo and elk and deer and all the animals of the country. And so he becomes president of the United States. He has the Lacey Act in his back pocket, and now he really wants to enforce the Lacey Act. So that means that you can no longer commercially hunt birds. And so there's all these eggers and plumers that they refer to, which is a old term because I don't hear that today. But those were groups of people who would go out and kill birds to get the plumes, the feathers, and so on, and then sell them on the open market, commercial hunting. Or eggers who would go and steal eggs or collect eggs for, I assume, for consumption primarily. And so here we go. We're going to get into Theodore Roosevelt and what he decides once he's president, okay? Because he wastes no time in going in and trying to save this island. And he's part of a group of people who just love birds and the Audubon Society, and they're always writing letters back and forth and talking about what needs to happen and how things need to be saved. And if they don't intervene, something's going to happen. And they're trying to get the public to buy into this, but they have a hard time. And keep in mind, it kind of reminds me of government today even. You have these Republican Democrat groups who are establishment, and they're very, very tied to different donors and, different lobbyists. And the plumers and the eggers are a powerful group of people with money who want to still be able to commercially hunt all these animals because their business relies on it. And some of these guys, this is what they have built their trade and their future on, their family wealth. And so I understand their plight as well, because they're now being told that their livelihood and maybe what they've been doing for 100 years is no longer a viable or legal activity. It really feels like, in a lot of ways, just this encroachment by government on private property, your right to life, liberty, and freedom. And you got to remember, we have this culture where commercial hunting, like, nobody even thought anything of it. There were no rules. You just got here and you just shot everything and could do what you want. Back to the book. Now, with the bully pulpit at his disposal, Roosevelt was finally going to put the plumers and eggers out of business once and for all. The main thrust of his policy was to strengthen the hand of the U.S. Biological Survey in Florida, perhaps having it oversee islets like Pelican Island. So there's this guy named Paul Kroger, all right? He would become Roosevelt's first wildlife warden. He was ironically born in Chemnitz, Germany on January 9th, 1864. So he's of German descent. In 1870, on a cold Christmas Eve, Paul Kroger was 6 years old. His mother and infant sister died during childbirth. And his distraught father, Gottlob, took Paul and his two-year-old brother, Arthur, and immigrated to the United States the next year. And he grows up in Florida, okay? The Krogels arrived in 1881. Florida was, as the novelist Wallace Stegner once wrote, a violent dreamland of six-shooter freedom and orange grove bliss. A forlorn place where the soil was so luxuriant everything grew wild and the trees didn't drop their leaves in winter. The Indian River region would be bleak, intimidating, and even lethal. But the lure of sunshine meant that every year more and more homesteaders arrived using machetes to cut away palm, sabal, and crazy weeds to plant crops. Clearly, there was something miraculous about Florida soil if, and only if, you could survive the coral snakes, diamondbacks, mosquito hordes, tropical storms, stark loneliness, and occasional frosts. Basically, Florida in 1881 was like the Wild West, a frontier of wilderness. Most villages like Sebastian didn't even have a wooden water tank or a one-room schoolhouse to call their own. By the time Paul Kroger was a teenager, his nickname around Sebastian was Pelican Watcher. Just above the tide line of Pelican Island, he enjoyed watching these comical birds cavort with one another. So Paul Kroger is, the book goes into more detail. I'm going to skip it, but he's way into birds, storks and so forth from his native country in Germany. As even a little kid, he was into watching birds. So then when he goes to Florida, of course, it's just in his nature. He grows up there. He's a pretty tough dude, lots of ingenuity, and he loves these birds, so he watches them all the time, okay? But it says keeping vigil over birds, however, wasn't a livelihood, as with just about all the first-generation settlers in post-Civil War Florida. Krogel's primary source of revenue came from farming. So he basically is an amazing guy where he can farm, he does things with birds. There's this picture right here in the book of him with a pelican that he's just like petting. And apparently these pelicans were so friendly and interested in humans that's not an uncommon thing, which made them easy to shoot and kill. Now, remember, a lot of people want to see the pelicans gone because they compete with the fishermen. And he grows up in this era, Krogel does. He's like a boat builder, a farmer, kind of a jack of all trades, but he kind of goes around and tries to protect the island, protect the birds best he can. And like I said, in 1900, they passed the law, the Lacey Act, which then says, hey, you can't do this. You can't kill these birds anymore. And so since it's now 1903 here in the book, and it says, as Krogel approached his 39th birthday, he's almost 40 years old in 1903, he wondered why the federal government wasn't stopping the massacre of these Pelican Island birds. After all, Washington, D.C. owned the island and half a dozen adjacent smaller keys in Indian River. Didn't the Lacey Act prohibit such reckless slaughter? Couldn't the Roosevelt administration ban it on federal property? Shouldn't the new law against killing pelicans be enforced as the one in Chemnitz was for storks? Wouldn't it be smart to create a bird reserve? Just asking these questions made Krogel an irregular character in the fishing community of Sebastian. So this guy, he's really concerned about these birds, and he would go out and actually count the number of birds in all these places, do these census, different types of birds. He wrote down their behavior, how skittish or not skittish they were. He'd track how many eggs, he'd count nests. So he's kind of this one-man show on just watching these birds and seeing what it is that causing some of these problems. And one of the things that they talk about was that the guano buildup and the big freezes that they had in some of these time periods just crushed the mangrove trees. And then that was a major destruction of habitat, which then caused more problems. So starting in 1902, the Florida Audubon Society paid Krogel a meager wage to patrol the Indian River Lagoon for plumers. Basically, a law is only as good as its enforcement. So at this time, there was no game warden. There was no one to enforce these laws. And so you had the Audubon Society and the Florida Audubon Society, which was a club, a group of people who paid dues, kind of like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, where they were part of this group, and all these people would come together who had a care and concern for birds, put their money together, and they would do initiatives to try to protect the birds. Well, they hire Krogel to protect the birds on Pelican Island. With his 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun always close at hand, ready to aim, Krogel was determined to save the approximately 3,000 brown pelicans on Pelican Island from the barbarians. With his sailboat weaving about in a sort of hurried dance, Krogel began patrolling the lagoon, threatening anybody who dared to disrupt his Indian River rookery. The worst offenders were thugs who sneaked onto the island under the cover of darkness. Because the channel was so narrow, all large vessels going up and down the river had to pass within a scant 100 feet of Pelican Island, keeping Krogel busy. If a boat dared anchor near the island, off Krogel went, like an arrow shot from a pulled bow. According to family lore, Krogel slept with one eye open. That's how seriously he took his wildlife protection job. Like Paul Kroger and other grassroots activists, Roosevelt had become disgusted that hunters in Florida would shoot a beautiful roseate spoonbill, so unscrupulous shops could sell its gorgeous wings as cooling fans to snowbird tourists in Miami and style-conscious debutantes in New York and Paris. Roosevelt was uninterested in compromises and in sidestepping conservation issues. When it came to protecting Florida's endangered wildlife, he was determined to choke the breath from the renegade plumer's business. Roosevelt wanted the Lacey Act followed to the letter of the law. The Roosevelt administration's threat of early 1903 was serious. Shoot a protected non-game bird and you go to jail. In some ways, Roosevelt and Krogel shared many of the plumer's rough and ready Jacksonian attributes. Unhappy, away from the outdoors, enamored of even the minutest habits of animal species, they prided themselves on their ability to track down wildlife by hunch and hoofprint. They were both a new breed of outdoorsmen who preached wildlife protection. Paul Krogel and Theodore Roosevelt share this common love and disdain, this common love for birds and this disdain for those that would hunt them to extinction. All right, so the next part of the story, you have this gentleman come on the stage, and his name is Frank Chapman, and he is a Florida bird expert, like an ornithologist, and he was the curator of ornithology and mammalogy at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Okay, and he and Krogel become friends, and Chapman's kind of an interesting guy. He's very educated, and but he produces a book about basically, hey, don't shoot birds anymore. Use your camera to capture birds. And so he gets made fun of by different people who are like, it's not the same thing, man. It's like us going out and elk hunting and taking pictures of elk instead of shooting an elk. Not the same. But his argument was, you can't eat these things. They're like little tiny, like songbirds. What's the point? And so there's this kind of cultural shift happening as he writes this book. That is kind of his way of sneaking in and getting the photographs. It feels like hunting, but it's not actually hunting. And anyway, that's kind of a side tangent. He though, like Roosevelt, like Krogel, has a deep passion for the birds and saving them, and they know that things aren't looking good. So then these two men start working together. I'll go to the book. So it was that in 1900, sensing the main chance to save Pelican Island, Krogel met with Chapman. And so they get together and they start working to save the island. And they get this idea. That they could set Pelican Island aside as a so-called government reservation by executive order of the United States. Okay. And this is where it gets kind of it gets interesting, because I'm not a huge fan of executive order in the sense that it's like a dictator just says, hey, from now on, we're going to do it this way. He didn't get the other branches of government involved and to buy off on these things and actually pass a law. So, and it's not really decided on by the people. It's just the president says, I'm going to do this. And then he does it. And so the small government conservative in me kind of is ruffled by that. But anyway, what happens is, Theodore Roosevelt, they concoct this plan. They're going to, by executive order, just make this a wildlife refuge. It says, this would, of course, be unprecedented, but it could nevertheless be done. If there was one thing Roosevelt loved, it was setting precedents. They set up a meeting in 1903 at the White House, and as noted in the prologue, Roosevelt handed them their reservation on a silver platter. With little more than a wave of the hand, Pelican Island was established as a federal reservation by the president's I so declare it. This was a revolutionary moment for biological conservation. Throughout America in 1903, land was being set aside for wildlife, but it was for private game preserves. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, for example, had sequestered a pristine 100,000-acre forested preserve and a resort hotel in Virginia saved 10,000 acres. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, in fact, in its 1903 yearbook, indicated that more and more large tracts of wilderness were being sold on the private market to the highest bidder. So the government had lands that they were selling on the private market as game preserves to wealthy people. And so as the way I kind of understand it is the government, Theodore Roosevelt, they're like, okay, if we sell this to this person, but it's under the rules of this has to be kept as a game preserve, they were able to do that. This idea was a complete departure where Theodore Roosevelt was going to say, okay, I'm going to completely take Pelican Island and I am going to designate it a federal bird reservation. And by doing that, he just declared it and it became so. And so this is kind of a bold move by Roosevelt. So basically Roosevelt, though, he wrote this thing up and he signed it and said, boom, it's the rule. It's now a reserve. And the book says this thing slipped by essentially unnoticed among reams of government appropriation and bills. Immediately, Roosevelt wanted to know the next steps needed to protect Pelican Island's wildlife. Could Krogel manage to protect the rookeries in Indian River Lagoon on his own? What other bird sanctuaries needed saving in Florida and elsewhere? These were the kind of probing questions Roosevelt wanted to ask Chapman and Dutcher. So basically, it says that wildlife needed paid guards to protect it from marauders. At Yellowstone National Park in July 1902, Colonel Charles Buffalo Jones had been appointed game warden, the first in U.S. governmental history. Now Krogel joined him as number 2, and Krogel was the first on behalf of birds. Hiring wardens like Jones and Krogel was ideally suited to Roosevelt's innate sheriff temperament. It's so fascinating because I look at this and I think, okay, Roosevelt could see, I have the advantage of reading this entire book multiple times. And so Roosevelt could see that the wildlife was being decimated. And he could try to go through these channels of government and get things put in place to protect them. But it was really, in some ways, a little bit anti-American, the idea that you could take land and then keep it in perpetuity owned by the government. So these public lands, federally managed public lands, almost seemed like the sort of lands like a king and queen would have in England. But Roosevelt was saying, no, it's not the same because the land is owned by all the people. It's sort of collectively owned. And instead of it being owned by simply one person, namely a king, but you had all these people who wanted land, who wealthy people who wanted it for logging, for mineral extraction, for wealth, and farming, cattle, so on. And when Roosevelt starts taking large swaths of this land and just setting it aside and saying, nope, sorry, but this is just going to be public land that will not be made private. And of course, that eventually that causes some problems. What's interesting is Roosevelt just did it. He didn't ask permission. He didn't try to talk people into it. He felt strongly that the wildlife needed protecting. And when he couldn't get the cooperation he needed, he did an executive order and just did it. And you can imagine the blowback he got from lumber companies and mining industry and so on, like all big business basically. And he just takes it. He just battles it throughout his presidency. And but this first one, it just slips under the radar. He just makes it happen. There it is. There it goes. And then Theodore Roosevelt realizes, he knows, like, just because you have a law doesn't mean squat if you don't have someone there to back up the law. So he goes ahead and once he makes these reserves, like it says, he creates your first game warden. And the first one was Charles J. Buffalo Jones, which was over the Yellowstone National Forest. And then Krogel was done here on Pelican Island. Word had been delivered loud and clear. President Roosevelt wanted the plumers and eggers flushed out. Following Roosevelt's executive order, a ferocious federal crackdown on market hunters rocked Florida. Roosevelt actually relished using the rule of law to incarcerate all the plumers and eggers who could be found. His sense of right and duty was as inflexible as adamant, John Burroughs wrote in his diary. Politicians found him a hard customer. So it's interesting because my heart goes out to, in some ways, it goes out to the eggers and plumers too. They're just out there trying to make a living. I don't know. Later, we'll read about an incident that, doesn't really paint them in the best light. They don't seem like the best human beings on the planet. That's for sure. This group anyway. But you can see how there's this cultural collide. It's like first you can market hunt and do all you want, and you built this, this income, and your family lives on this being a plumer, and now you're going to take that away. And now you're going to enforce it with the law. So as you can imagine, people in the United States, we don't like the government telling us what to do that much. And things get dark, and something real bad happens here coming up. So the opening salvo in the crusade to save American wildlife had been fired by President Roosevelt. When Warden Krugel now pointed a rifle at a pelican poacher, he was doing so with the full authority of the President of the United States. Once again, Roosevelt's genius as a conservationist was that he never listened to other politicians about how to get things done. His instinct was always to turn to the professional biologists, foresters, and field naturalists first. Over and over again, this was the formula Roosevelt used to eventually set aside more than 234 million acres of America for posterity. And as he turned to them and he heard from them what to do, he would turn to the political arena, and he could see that they wouldn't ever see it the right way, that they wouldn't value it like the naturalists do, that they wouldn't see the need to save the buffalo. And you can understand, if you really think about it, you can understand that because, if you're a settler in the United States and you're just trying to survive, you're not worried about the buffalo being wiped out. I mean, it's a bummer, and you hope they won't be wiped out, but your concern is just staying alive, making a living, having a family, trying to eke out an existence. And so I think we often poorly judge our ancestors, unfairly so. We didn't grow up in that time. We didn't have the hardships and the trials that they had. And to look at them through our lens now and say, oh, they were so bad, they were killing all the birds. It's like, you say that now, but you look at other third world countries or countries where people are just barely getting by. Nature is not of their main concern. It's just living from day to day. But nevertheless, I think it was remarkable that Theodore Roosevelt could see how important it was to save our wildlife and the natural world and preserve it, and therefore went about through executive order, basically, this process of setting aside federally managed lands and public lands, and then bringing in law enforcement in the form of game wardens to enforce those rules. And it worked. But it didn't go without some losses. So there's this gentleman by the name of Guy Bradley, and he was a former plume hunter, but now he was a bird protector. And he was basically paid to be a game warden with Krogel. It says here in the book that the year that he was enforcing the law, the price offered to hunters for egret plumes rose to $32 an ounce, more than twice the price for an ounce of gold. So these feathers were worth a lot of money. And it said 4 egrets had to die to yield an ounce of plumes. And Bradley's vigilance had helped create a scarcity that was driving the price up. So the bird feathers were highly sought after, and because the game wardens had done such a good job, it was getting more and more expensive to try to get these feathers, and therefore the price had gone through the roof. Now you're incentivizing people to go out and break the law because it's so lucrative to do so. And it just made these bird rookeries really tempting to plume hunters. So things get real hot, and plumers are out there getting more and more dangerous, and they're killing birds and running off with them, and it creates this real hot environment, and they're shooting at each other, and the game wardens are doing their job, and the plumers are trying to do theirs and steal these feathers. And Chapman writes in his journal, he says, "That man Bradley is going to be killed sometime. He has been shot at more than once, and someday they are going to get him." And so Bradley's the ex-plumer who's now a game warden. So Chapman writes this in his journal. And remember, he's the ornithologist that works at the museum. who's a bird lover, and his diary proves to be prophetic. On the morning of July 8, 1905, Bradley heard rolling gunfire at Oyster Key's rookery. Using binoculars, he could see the familiar blue boat the Smith gang often used for conducting raids. So he sees this boat. It's the Smith gang. The Smith gang is this group of plumers that are notoriously violent and are a problem. So Bradley hops in his dinghy and he rows toward the tiny island, determined to stop the killing of the birds. Stupefied with anger, Bradley quite simply wasn't going to suffer another embarrassing massacre on his watch. The Smith gang, it turned out, ignoring the Roosevelt administration's admonitions, was murdering double-crested cormorants by emptying magazines into their breeding grounds. Like all colonial birds, double-crested cormorants congregated on islands close to shore, easily detectable even by a novice bird watcher because of their shiny black and bronze plumage. Cormorants were considered a nuisance by fisherfolk. In the spring and summer, many of these long-necked aquatic birds nested along Florida's coast, while others migrated southward to Florida from more northern nesting grounds. Somewhat unsteadily, Bradley approached the Smith gang at Oyster Keys, demanding that they drop their guns. He was the law and had come there to make arrests. From the moment he spoke, he was greeted with resistance. A quarrel ensued over whether an arrest warrant was necessary on the waterways. Meanwhile, wounded birds, in a frenzy, let out a terrified chant. The initial tension heightened to ferocity. Harsh words were spoken. As the dispute intensified, a sharpshooter in the Smith gang suddenly shot Bradley in the chest, as if he had been wearing a bullseye on his work shirt. He never knew what hit him, Walter Smith, head of the gang, the murderer, later told the police. Bradley slumped forward in the bow, bleeding profusely, motionless. His dinghy drifted westward in the slate-gray water. It journeyed over a reef, away from Oyster Keys and out to sea. The corpse of Bradley disappeared into the distant horizon as the Smith gang stood and watched from the shore. Bradley had died a martyr in the line of duty, murdered trying to stop an outlaw plumer gang. There is no clear record of how Paul Kroger took the murder of Guy Bradley. All we know is that he retrieved the Audubon, which is the boat he was in, and continued to patrol Pelican Island in the boat he had built for Bradley. It's hard for us to grasp it, but the man who was put in jail was Walt Smith for shooting Guy Bradley, and turns out, he never does get in trouble. There's a little piece here that says the grand jury was set against putting a Key West man on trial, especially a former officer of the Confederate Army. They refused to indict a well-known poacher who admitted to killing of a lawman, and they opened up the jailhouse door and sent him home. There's a lot of creative license there. There's a lot that we don't really know, but it turns out that nothing really happens to the Smith gang, that they were able to kill a man, murder him, and then have no consequences. In fact, there are quotes of Walt Smith bragging about killing him. So it's a different time, It's a Wild West, really a different world than what we're accustomed to today. But that's the situation and kind of an early picture of what Theodore Roosevelt and other conservationists were doing at the turn of the century in the early 1900s as he became president. He was president from, I think, 1901 to 1909. And during that time, he sets aside more than 234 million, something like that, acres of land as public land. Now, this public land today is about, I think it's like it makes up about 18%. Federally managed public land is about 18% of the country's land. The rest of it is all private property. And when you think about that, I often think about this because those public lands are owned by all Americans. So whether you're from New York, LA, Dallas, the lands right here behind my studio here on the hill, they're all owned by everyone, these federally managed public lands. And that's a pretty sweet thing. It's basically the envy of the world. It's not something that the rest of the world has, and we are able to enjoy it and use it. And often I am confronted by people who want to privatize these public lands. They feel like it's more American to make these lands private than to allow them to be quote unquote owned and operated by the government. The thing is they're not owned and operated by the government. They're owned by American by U.S. citizens. That's what it means to be American. You get to inherit all these lands. They're all yours. They're mine. I've been using them and hunting on them and camping on them and exploring them my whole life. Now, if I was in another country, say Britain, England, I couldn't just go out into these wilderness areas and explore them. I'd have to get permission. Those lands would be locked to me. They'd be owned by other people. They'd be private. My choices would be quite limited in the places I could go see. And that's one thing that makes America great. I've been to New Zealand a couple of times now. I'm going to go back here in a few short weeks. New Zealand is incredible like that. The amount of public land that they have and just nature and wildlife, it's spectacular. I can't imagine a world or a country, living in a country that doesn't have it. And I've taken my public lands for granted. And there are those who think that public land should be in the hands of private citizens and should be, the government has no role. To that, I disagree, because we have shown over the last more than 100 years that this model works. We have more wildlife restored in our country than was imaginable. We have elk and deer and moose and wolf and bear populations that we thought were on the verge of extinction. Ducks and waterfowl. We are the crown jewel of the world in terms of how much land and country we have that is set aside for wildlife, and how much our wildlife thrives despite civilization being rampant across the country. And so it works. It flat out works. And so I don't see the need to privatize it. And I also don't trust, as long as the land is owned by all the people, we the people get to decide how it's used and how it's leveraged. You put it in the hands of a private citizen, they can do what they want with it. They can turn it into a strip mall. They can turn it into a resort. They can turn it into whatever. And to my way of thinking, more than 80% of this country is already in the hands of private folks. Can we not leave at least 20% of it to nature? Can the grizzly bear, the moose, the wolf, the elk and the deer and the caribou and so on, can they not have 20% of it? Can we not share 20% of it and leave it alone? Because undoubtedly there is a huge group of animals that cannot survive in the midst of civilization. Some can, like whitetail, coyotes. Those critters thrive in cities and on the edge of cities. But grizzlies don't. They don't. They need huge swaths of untouched, uninhabited, unhuman, lived-in land to truly survive. Wolves are a lot the same. They just encroach too much on human beings when they live near us. So like I said, there are some animals that do well and some that don't. And those are just kind of the megafauna ones. But what about sage grouse and other critters that, without their breeding grounds and without the right blend of grasses and the right terrain, they'll become extinct. So, man, I just often think like 20%. Can we not give up 20%? And we can just buy and sell what we have already set aside, that 80% that's left. I think a lot of people, they'll say, well, Brian, if we just took that land from the government and put it back in the hands of the people, as if we don't already own it. They say, if we put it back in the hands of the people, then I could afford a house. I could afford this, or I could buy that. I'm like, you're not going to get your hands on that land. You're not going to be the one. I'm not going to be the one. I can't afford it. I can't buy that land. And the idea that if we take that land that's ours already, and then we privatize it, that somehow that'll benefit us in some way more greatly than it does now, I think it's foolish. I think it's very foolish. I think it's short-sighted. And I think politicians, they use your oppression and hey, I can't afford a house. I can't do that. And they say, if we could just take these lands and give them back to the state, and the state could then give them to the people, this is not going to happen. It's not how it goes. That's a lie. That's what politicians will often do in order to steal your inheritance, because those lands are already yours. Yeah, you can't build a house on it. Who cares? Who cares? There's other places I can build a house. I can rent a modest home. I can do things. But hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres, millions of acres that I can just go and hunt on, live on, exercise on, camp on. You can't put a price on that to me. So anyway, I hope you got something out of today's podcast. If you are ambitious, you should read this book, written by Douglas Brinkley, New York Times bestseller, The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt, and the Crusade for America. If you like this, leave a comment, like this video. We always appreciate that. Don't forget to support us using our codes. Go to the description field in the YouTube videos. And if you're into some of those brands and products that are working with us, help them out. Thanks for tuning in. Stay gritty.